I now would like to invite my son, Nate Davis, to come forward and light the chalice and lead us in our affirmation of covenant, which is in your order of service.
I light this chalice with these words. Open our eyes to see what is beautiful. Open our minds to learn what is true. Open our hearts to love one another.
The rest of it.
Please join me in the affirmation of covenant, which you'll find printed in your service saying,
Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest for truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and freedom, to serve humankind in fellowship, to the end that all souls shall grow into harmony with the divine. Thus do we covenant with each other. There's a story about Emily Dickinson that when she was 25, she traveled to Washington, D.C., where her father was finishing up his one term serving in the House of Representatives. For 3 weeks, she met and charmed her father's friends with her intellect and wit. And then she traveled on to Philadelphia to visit her friend Eliza Coleman. Eliza was the daughter of a Presbyterian minister who introduced her to his married colleague, the Reverend Charles Wadsworth, who is described as a very serious fellow. He and Emily became fast friends and kept up a correspondence for more than 25 years until his death. She saved all his letters. One spring day in 1860, Wadsworth showed up unexpectedly at her home in Amherst, Massachusetts, and took her for a carriage ride. Nobody knows what they talked about or anything else about that carriage ride. It is reported that as they began, Emily's younger sister ran next door to their brother's house and told his wife that she was afraid Emily would go away with the clergyman. But they came back, and then Emily locked herself in her room. A week later, she suffered a health crisis which was diagnosed as nervous shock. The next year, Wadsworth announced to his congregation that he had accepted an invitation to serve a church in San Francisco, and after another year, he went there. Some biographers have interpreted this combination of events to mean that one of them had fallen in love with the other, and what they talked about in the carriage had to do with their relationship and possibly his plan to go to San Francisco. They cite as supporting evidence her instructions that upon her death, all of his letters to her should be burned. That might be, but here's another reading. Emily Dickinson regularly attended a congregational church with her family, but never joined it. Her family wished she were more religious. At boarding school at Mount Holyoke, she refused to participate in the school's Christmas observances, citing her family's disposition not to celebrate Christmas because it was too pagan and materialistic. And at the same time, she would not call herself a Christian. So was this serious and married fellow, the Reverend Wadsworth, courting her or counseling her? Was the shock after the carriage ride to her heart or to her soul? After his death many years later, she referred to him as her shepherd from little girlhood. Maybe she wanted the letters burned to protect her heart's secrets on an entirely different matter, her unconventional spiritual journey. And here's another possibility. Perhaps there was no crisis of love or theology, and the carriage ride simply coincided with a purely health-related crisis. That's also possible. We cannot know. If her visit with Wadsworth did bring some distressing news, it was one of several changes happening at about the same time. That same month, her close friend, the editor and publisher Samuel Bowles, left for Europe just as she was getting up courage to consider publishing her poetry. And the political atmosphere in those months before the 1860 election would have been especially charged. The body of Amherst's first Civil War casualty came home just a year later. Beginning around this time, she never again left Amherst and lived more and more reclusively as the years passed. For her remaining span of 26 years, her small bedroom became more and more her sanctuary. In Will There Really Be a Morning, written about a year before the carriage ride, Dickinson described herself as a little pilgrim, wondering if the view from tall mountains or advice from more well-traveled strangers could help her find a place she can go, called mourning. The question, will there really be a morning, dismisses the notion that mourning is a time and suggests instead it's an experience. Her answer finesses the possibility that this experience can be enacted or brought about, assuming instead that it is a destination one can inhabit. A pilgrim, of course, is someone on a journey. A New England Congregationalist might easily feel that identity, a pilgrim, as an inheritance, and might also assume that a pilgrim's proper destination is New England, or the place where one is. How much more expansively might a New Englander who resisted church membership and even the name Christian imagine their journey? How far would that journey go? Perhaps a little pilgrim could not go far, could not see far, had never heard, therefore, of famous countries. How to get one's bearings? In what direction is morning or day to be found? The image of the little pilgrim looking wonderingly at the tall mountains, wanting their height to see the light, easily suggests being surrounded by mountains in a valley of shadow, or in a protected place, a shadowy sort of sanctuary. A little over a decade ago, I experienced a time of big changes, a temporary detour from parish ministry before I went to New Orleans. It led me into shadowy sanctuaries. First into a couple of years of hospital chaplaincy, and then into unemployment. I did not know where this time of change was leading. I had to work hard to get my bearings. The most important thing I did to get my bearings was to show up. Not to try to show up on a mountaintop to gain a clear view or illusion of tomorrow, but to show up today in the valley where I found myself and meet it on its own terms. Understand where I was and what was being asked or required of me. Initially, I accepted part-time work at the hospital, but needing more income, I asked if there was any way to increase me to full-time. The ad I answered was for a part-time position, so I had assumed that that's all they were offering. When after a month or so I asked about going full-time, came the answer, "Oh, I didn't think you wanted full-time." "Yes, we can do that." So that was easy. And I was very glad of that, because the prospect of balancing 2 part-time jobs wore me out just thinking about it. This was in Houston. Think of the driving alone. I already had my hands full trying to sell the only house I'd ever owned. Showing up in the shadows at the hospital where chaplains are asked and often required to go, into hopeless medical situations, into sinking emotional territories, also required me on my own time to show up for my own wounds and struggles, so as not to let those intrude on my work. I had my own struggles with hope to tend, my own emotional swamps to traverse, reconsidering what kind of ministry I was called to, wondering if chaplaincy could fit my calling, asking myself where I was rooted and what strengths I brought to this valley of shadows. Where was morning here? Dickinson asks if morning has feet like water lilies. Did you notice that line? Such an interesting question. Though they seem to walk on water or float there, water lilies are tethered to deep roots. Their stems connect under the bed of their pond or pool to a rhizome which feeds them. These feet supply the nutrients for sending forth new shoots and sustain the plant when it dies back in the winter. Dickinson was a gardener and fond of lilies. She would have known all this. Yes, perhaps morning does have feet like water lilies, deep, somewhat detached, and distant roots in darkness that fuel the light the way the rhizome fuels the lily flower that looks toward the light. While working as a full-time chaplain and continuing into my period of unemployment, I turned to friends and to a spiritual director to help me keep my feet. My friend Constance was my mainstay during this time. She knows me well. She was that friend I could call at the end of the day or any time to talk about what I was feeling, often just to name it. She's also that friend who, as the saying goes, sings my life song back to me when I've forgotten the words. With my spiritual director, Abbot Michael, I spent a lot of time working through my discernment about my call to ministry. Michael heard my story and my struggles with fresh ears and coached me on how to adjust and enrich my spiritual practice life to meet the challenges and needs I had in the place where I was. Each in their own way, Constance's help rooted in our relationship, Michael's rooted in faith, fed me in that darkness. They strengthened me to lean toward the light and store up its warmth. I learned, like the water lily, to interact with my roots as I looked to morning. During the subsequent time of unemployment, because I had been an employee at the hospital, I was able to draw unemployment compensation. I had never been eligible for that before. Similarly, I was drawing on the stored fund of spiritual nutrients gathered during my chaplaincy from the work itself and from my feet. Gradually, I gained a clearer vision of my strengths and calling. I held my particular role as a chaplain more lightly while holding fast to my strengths and sources of vitality. I also held unemployment lightly, referring to it as my extended unfunded sabbatical. Dickinson asks, does morning have feathers like a bird? 2 years later, she would answer herself. You know the poem. Hope is a thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it has to crumb of me. The feathered thing's song in storms, like the light of morning toward the shadows, freely and abundantly offers sweet warmth. The light reaches in from without. The song reaches out from within. In that time of big changes, I said no to half-time work because I couldn't imagine it. I found full-time work doing something I was able but not called to do. Living into that choice, I learned. In time, I imagined a new way. Living into that vision, I became familiar with its light and song and made it a sanctuary, lightly held, a place where morning was for me, where I could be in the storm with the song, where I could be in the shadow and stretch toward ever-present light. So may you know where the light is and hear your song in each changing moment. And when you begin to wonder if there will be a morning, may love's light find you and hope's song live in your soul. So may it be. Amen.
I'm going to ask Nate to come forward and extinguish our chalice. Please join in saying our closing words, which are in your order of service. Go out into the world in peace. Have courage. Hold on to what is good. Return to no person evil for evil.
Strengthen the faint-hearted, support the weak, help the suffering, honor all beings, and may love's light and hope's song be yours.